The end of the Cretaceous period in Africa has long been a paleontological black hole. Not a lot of information has come out. We've had very few fossils and very little idea of what lived in Africa at the very end of the age of dinosaurs. In recent years, my colleagues and I have been trying to change that by describing new fossils from the latest Maastrichtian of Morocco. And what we're seeing is a highly diverse fauna living just before the extinction of the dinosaurs. This is the dinosaurs in their twilight era. And it's a unique fauna, a kind of lost world with dinosaurs, unlike what we see anywhere else in the world, distinct species and distinct lineages. And I'm going to talk about the implications of this fauna for dinosaur evolution, dinosaur extinction, and Africa's last dinosaurs. So one of the most fascinating things about dinosaurs, of course, is their extinction. This is a group that dominated in terrestrial ecosystems for more than 150 million years, and then suddenly vanished everywhere around the world. Now, as a student, I recall a scientist once saying something effective, well, who cares how the dinosaurs went extinct? I'm too busy studying how they lived. And I have to disagree with that. These were the dominant carnivores, the dominant herbivores everywhere in the world, and then suddenly they're gone. This is a group that had been so successful for so long, you would think nothing could possibly wipe them out, and yet somehow they disappeared. And so saying we don't really care why they went extinct, it seems like intellectual sour grapes to me. Like, kind of can't answer this big question, this big mystery. And so, well, it's just not an interesting question. Who cares? Well, I think it is an interesting question. And for a number of different reasons, not just for what it tells us about dinosaurs, but for what it tells us about evolution. So the question of dinosaur extinction gets into these broader questions of evolution. Beyond the question of why did T-Rex go extinct, we have these bigger debates in evolution about the patterns and processes that drive evolution. And one of the biggest debates in evolutionary biology, the debate between catastrophism versus gradualism. So in the 19th century, Cuvier, one of the first paleontologists, saw a major role for catastrophe in driving extinctions. He saw catastrophic events like floods and volcanoes wiping out huge numbers of species. And these were both metaphorically and literally acts of God. Cuvier was still a creationist because Darwin hadn't written The Origin, yet he couldn't really be anything else. So Cuvier believed that God created huge numbers of species, wiped them out with catastrophes, then created new ones to replace them. Darwin obviously took a very different view of evolution. He tried to explain evolution and extinction as well in terms of everyday natural processes, things like competition, predation, environmental change. And he argued that these could incrementally over millions of years, the same way that the sea wears down the sea cliffs, would slowly wipe out species. And Darwin's ideas they won out for the most part through most of the 20th century. People invoked gradual processes as driving extinction and driving evolution. And it seems kind of obvious if you want to have a scientific, rational, natural explanation for evolution, whereas catastrophes seem kind of supernatural. Again, acts of God. They're supernatural, literally in the sense that they're not like beyond the natural processes, at least that we see in short time scales. So Darwin seemed more rational, and people kind of went in that direction. And then in the late 20th century, the idea of catastrophic mass extinction made a massive comeback as we got more information about the fossil record, perhaps also because we developed nuclear bombs and people were worried about a catastrophic extinction of our species. People started thinking about catastrophes and how they influenced evolution. So in the late 20th century, we see a resurgence in the idea of catastrophic mass extinction. Again, partly these great big syntheses of the fossil record, things done by guys like Raup and Sapkowski, but also in particular the extinction of the dinosaurs, some new information about their extinction. So in I guess it was 1980 or 1979, they described the iridium-rich KPG boundary layer, the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, and this was found to be heavily enriched in a mineral called, or an element called iridium, which is pretty rare on the surface of the Earth, but common in asteroids. And this was interpreted as evidence that the KPG boundary, which is not it's not an arbitrary line drawn on a map, like the boundary between, France and Germany. The KPG boundary is a physical layer of sediment that you can find in many places around the world. And this layer that separates the Cretaceous rocks and the Paleogene rocks is enriched in iridium, is the debris layer of a giant asteroid impact. And then somewhat later, the giant Chicxulub asteroid impact crater, which is more than 100 miles in diameter, currently buried under the Yucatan Peninsula, was described and recognized as the impact crater that was associated with this ejecta layer. So what it was proposed was that dust and soot launched into the high atmosphere, darkened the skies. This impact debris was shot into the atmosphere, and this caused a darkening of the skies, a shutdown of photosynthesis, and global cooling. And this basically starves and freezes the planet, and this drives the extinctions we see at the end of the Cretaceous, including the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, the dinosaurs have been a major part of this debate. In some ways, maybe they're not there's lots of other species out there, and in some way, some of these have much better fossil records, things like foraminifera, fossil seashells, fossil pollen. But dinosaurs are still important. They're as the dominant large herbivores and large carnivores. They're telling you about what's happening to the terrestrial ecosystem. And when these things suddenly vanish, that's a pretty big clue that something major is happening here. So one major question has been whether the dinosaurs were in decline before the asteroid impact, and if so, whether this decline might have contributed to their extinction in the Maastrichtian. Were there some gradual processes kind of acting in addition to this catastrophic process, the impact of the asteroid impact? And a number of different studies have argued that dinosaur species richness is in decline in the final 10 million years of the Cretaceous. Now, this is heavily driven by the fossil record of the western interior of North America. And it kind of has to be. That's kind of got the best record. We've got more dinosaurs in the Cretaceous there than anywhere else in the world in terms of the sheer number of species. Also just a vast number of skeletons, T-Rex, Dinosaurs, Triceratops, all these things. And we don't really have anything comparable anywhere else in the world. So if you want to study dinosaur evolution, this is kind of the best place to do it. But there are a number of problems, I would argue, with interpreting this as supporting some type of ecological crisis or long-term decline prior to the asteroid extinction. So a couple of issues. First, is it really meaningful to say that the T-Rex Triceratops fauna we see in the Hell Creek is lower in diversity than the Judithian fauna that we see in the Dinosaur Park Formation, in the sense that the Dinosaur Park Formation fauna is the most diverse dinosaur fauna we have from anywhere in the world at any time period. So everything's lower in diversity than that. It's kind of like saying, yeah, well, Bill Gates is poor because he has less money than Elon Musk. Well, everybody does. It's not really meaningful. So the Dinosaur Park Formation might just be an outlier. It might be a biodiversity hotspot. It certainly has exceptional preservation and abundance of fossils. And, is it really meaningful to say that this one particular locality has higher diversity than 10 million years later? I'm not really convinced that that is meaningful. And another major issue is if this decline is happening here, if we're getting lower diversity in Alberta and Montana as we go in the final 10 million years, is this a global phenomenon or just a local phenomenon? It's really difficult, I think, to overstate the impact of these Western interior assemblages when you're looking at dinosaur diversity curves or trying to reconstruct speciation rates, because there's so many species from this one little locality. Something like 40 species are known from the late Campanian in Dinosaur Park. This is more dinosaurs than known from any other time and place in the world, and it's close to something like 5% of all dinosaur species come from this one locality. So this outlier data point really heavily impacts, the global patterns, because there's so much data here and so many species here and so little data from anywhere else. So I'm not really convinced that this is really telling us that much, other than the fact that this one little habitat was super diverse. And maybe that there was some diversity decline in northern North America. What about the rest of the world? What's going on there? So I've been really interested since I was a grad student in trying to find dinosaur faunas from elsewhere in the world besides the Hell Creek from the very end of the Cretaceous period. Now, we do have these Maastrichtian dinosaur faunas in places like Mongolia, Madagascar, South America, the Maastrichtian being the very end of the Cretaceous period. And these faunas are a bit frustrating for a number of reasons. In some cases, their age is somewhat uncertain. Mongolia and Madagascar are thought to be Maastrichtian, but that's a long time period, somewhere between 72 and 66 million years. Are they coming from the early Maastrichtian, the middle, or the very end, that kind of final million years of the Cretaceous? We don't really know. They're not well enough dated at this point, and it'd be really interesting to know, but we still need to do that work. In other cases, we have some pretty we have some better constraints, but formations and faunas seem to be a bit earlier. They're not at the very, very end. So it seems like a lot of these Patagonian faunas from Argentina are, they're Maastrichtian, but not latest Maastrichtian. So this narrow little interval, the very, very end of the age of dinosaurs, is actually not well represented around the world. There's relatively few places where you can find dinosaurs in that final million years. And because of that, it's very difficult to say whether the patterns we're seeing in the Western interior, this supposed decline, whether this is a general phenomenon worldwide or something more regional. And in particular, my hunch is that if there is this cooling trend at the very end of the Cretaceous period, this might be hitting high latitude assemblages, and Canada and Montana were even further north than they are today, but maybe they're hanging on at pretty high diversity or even diversifying at lower latitudes. And so again, we just have this issue. Is there really something going on with dinosaurs as a whole, or is it just this one part of the world and we really need other faunas from that end of the Cretaceous interval from other parts of the world? Now, unfortunately, you can't just go out and decide you're going to dig somewhere and find 66 million year old dinosaurs. There are a relatively limited number of places in the world where you can go find dinosaurs from this time period. First of all, you need to find a place where dinosaur bones were being buried in sediments that were forming 66 million years ago. So if dinosaurs are living in a desert where there's bones lay out and are broken down and the surface is slowly eroding away, you're not going to get deposition. You will not find dinosaurs in those areas. Likewise, up in the mountains where there's a lot of erosion, you're not going to find dinosaurs. And so you need to be in the right place. You need to be somewhere where sedimentary processes, streams, rivers, sometimes oceans, are depositing sediments and burying dinosaur bones. First they have to be buried. Second, the processes going on, biological, chemical, in the soil, in the sand, need to be such that they preserve the bones rather than cause them to break down. So if there's soil acids, for example, the bones just dissolve away. Sometimes bugs eat the bones. So they have to be preserved. So first, burial has to be happening in this environment. Second, the bones have to be preserved. And the next thing that has to happen is they have to be preserved for 66 million years. So a lot of dinosaurs were buried in stream beds or lakes or whatever, but then those sediments were eroded away. So all those bones were initially preserved and then destroyed. Over 66 million years, a large percentage of the dinosaur bones that were buried has since been destroyed. So that they have to survive long term. And then here's the final thing that has to happen. Having been buried, preserved, and then not eroded for 66 million years, these rocks have to occur close enough to the surface where they can be exposed by erosion or some other process that we can prospect them. So there are probably a huge number of dinosaurs that are buried, 50, 100, 1,000 feet under the ground or a mile underground, and we're just never going to get there. So there must be vast numbers, maybe millions of T-Rexes buried underground that we're just never going to see. So again, we're looking for this kind of needle in a haystack of a handful of remains that were buried, survived long-term, are now being exposed, and we can go out and find them. And there's just a handful of places in the world where you can do this and sample this final end Cretaceous interval. Now, one of the last places you would think to do this is in the late Maastrichtian of Morocco. Why is that? Well, Morocco has a lot of fossils. The problem is they're marine. We have sediments deposited 66 million years ago, just before dinosaur extinction. And these sediments are preserved east of Casablanca today. It's about an hour from the airport. And there's huge amounts of sediment out there, tons of fossils. But this is when Morocco was covered by a sea, a shallow seaway extended across much of Morocco as far as the Atlas Mountains. This is underwater. And so mostly what we're getting here is marine organisms. We're finding mosasaurs, we're finding plesiosaurs, we're finding fish and sharks and ocean-going pterosaurs. And this seems like a terrible place to hunt for dinosaurs, which are land animals. A marine assemblage does not seem like the right place to go. But dinosaurs do sometimes drift out to sea. Maybe, I don't know how they're getting there, if they're dying on the beaches and being washed out to sea, if they're carried downstream by a river or by floods, how this is happening. But land animals do wash out to sea and are sometimes buried in marine rocks. And it doesn't happen often. I would guess that this, of the fossils you find in marine assemblage, that marine vertebrates outnumber dinosaurs, terrestrial animals, by something like a factor of 1,000 to 1 or maybe 10,000 to 1. You have multiple orders of magnitude. So what does this mean? What this means that if you want to hunt for dinosaurs in marine assemblage, you're going to have to look at thousands of marine reptile specimens and marine vertebrates to find one dinosaur. If you want to put together a fauna of dinosaurs from marine assemblage, you would have to look at vast numbers of fossils. Fortunately, what we have in Morocco are vast numbers of fossils to go through to find this, this improbable lightning strike of a terrestrial dinosaur in a marine assemblage, and then do that again and again and again for many years, which is what we've been doing. So the phosphate mines produce marine reptiles, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs by the thousands. They're isolated teeth, jaws, various bones, frontals and humeri, and skulls, plesiosaur paddles, and mosasaur flippers and tails, and occasionally complete skeletons. These things are pretty broken up by probably scavenging by sharks and mosasaurs. It tends to be kind of a broken up fauna, but sometimes you get some really spectacularly complete things there. And they're incredibly abundant in these deposits. These deposits are being strip mined for fertilizer. So in the process of digging up these ancient marine phosphates, for the phosphate, it's a limiting nutrient, so it's very important in fertilizers. You use it in crops throughout the hemisphere. These huge strip mines that you can see from space, stretching over tens of kilometers, have exposed vast numbers of skeletons, and in the process, a dinosaur fauna has emerged. And we've been putting this together specimen by specimen, bone by bone, tooth by tooth over many years. But we're starting to get a picture of what dinosaurs lived in Africa at the end of the Cretaceous period as a result of this. So the dinosaurs tend to preserve as isolated bones and teeth, occasionally associated but fragmentary skulls and skeletons. So to understand the mode of preservation, these are animals that were floating out to sea. Maybe they're carcasses or skeletons being, partially decomposing skeletons being, again, swept out to sea by a flood or something like that. And as they're floating out to sea, they're kind of drifting along. They're being scavenged by sharks and by mosasaurs. They're rotting. Bits are being torn off. Bits are falling off as they decompose. So our finding isn't terribly complete. And again, it's pretty rare. So we're getting, again, teeth, bones, very fragmentary specimens. And it might not seem all that impressive, but as they say, in the land of the blind, the man with one eye is king. When you have nothing to go on, basically complete absence of information, even a little bit of information is a dramatic improvement in our situation. We have almost no other dinosaurs from the end of the Cretaceous, from the end of the Maastrichtian in Africa, and only a handful of sites around the world from 66 million years ago. So this stuff is important. A new T-Rex skeleton doesn't really excite me very much because it's unlikely to tell us something the first 20 T-Rex skeletons didn't already tell us. Like, oh, look how short the arms are. Yeah, we knew. It's really big. Yeah, I know all this. Like we've been looking at T-Rex for over 100 years now. And I'm not saying there's no point in these skeletons, but they're a lot less interesting to me than something that is highly incomplete but completely novel. And that's what we're getting in Morocco. This stuff is novel. Every little bone we get from the late Maastrichtian in Morocco expands our knowledge of dinosaur evolution and dinosaur diversity far more than a complete T-Rex or Triceratops skeleton ever could. The fossils are not always spectacular, but they're filling a gap in our knowledge. So for me, these fossils are exciting in a way that T-Rex can never be. T-Rex is known, it's well studied, we have lots of specimens. This stuff is completely unknown. Almost everything we find is new, and that's exciting. It's exciting for me to see something new and see species that we've never seen before and didn't even suspect existed. So one of the first things to emerge was a large abelisaurid theropod. This seems to be a pretty big animal, probably something around 9 or 10 meters long by abelisaur standards. This is probably one of the largest known. And originally, these were reported in the form of just isolated teeth. And curiously, they're rooted teeth, which is that the tooth root is still attached rather than having the root resorbed, which is typical of shed teeth. So why do we see this? Well, shed teeth and rooted teeth actually tell you something very different. Shed teeth are shed by the animal while it's alive. I mean, you're like your baby teeth, it popped out, but you're still alive, and you kind of keep on going about your life. In the same way, when a dinosaur sheds its teeth, it's coming out of a living animal. So as a result, we basically don't find shed teeth in the marine assemblage because dinosaurs didn't live in the water. They only end up in the water when they're dead, when they're floating out to sea. So what this tells us, the fact that we're finding these rooted teeth, is they're falling out of carcasses. They're falling out of jaws, they're falling out of skulls, which is really frustrating because somewhere there's like, a complete abelisaur skull and it's kind of floating along, a few teeth drop out, we find those, and who knows what happened to the skull. Maybe it was never preserved. Maybe it floated all the way out into the middle of the Atlantic. Maybe it was destroyed by mining. We'll never really know. So it's kind of tantalizing to find these rooted teeth and know that this came from a skeleton. And however, we have started finding some more complete remains of abelisaurs. So a few years ago, a partial jaw turned up, a partial lower jaw of a large abelisaurid. And we described and named this animal as Titanosaurus barbaricus. At the time we described it, the relationships were somewhat uncertain. It looked a bit different from most of the other abelisaurs out there. So I kind of thought, well, maybe it's some sort of deep diverging lineage that isn't really closely related to the other things. Africa's probably been isolated by it for quite a while at this time, and maybe these abelisaurs have been kind of evolving in isolation. But fortunately, I've been able to look at some fossils and get a better idea of what's going on with this animal. So I recently got a chance to look at the holotype specimen and only specimen of Carnotaurus from the Maastrichtian of Argentina. And taking a really close look at Carnotaurus, there turned out to be a number of similarities that I'd missed that link this animal to Carnotaurus. So for example, the Machelian groove, the groove on the inside of the dennary, is highly reduced. Carnotaurus and Titanosaurus share that. Another feature that's kind of unusual in our animal is the interdental plates that cover the medial surface of the teeth are highly reduced in the back of the jaw. Again, this is a very Carnotaurus-like feature that we see in Titanosaurus. So it seems like our African abelisaurs are related to the South American things, which is not entirely surprising. The Africa was connected up to South America until about 100 million years ago. And so up until that point, they could simply have walked from one place to the other. And even after they broke apart, there was probably a fairly narrow waterway that they might have been able to cross. So it's not entirely shocking to find a South American faunal connection to our Moroccan carnivores. More recently, this bone turned up. This is a really interesting specimen. It's an isolated tibia, which is unfortunately broken distally. The end of the tibia and the tarsals tend to be really interesting bones. So we're missing that. But what we have is actually pretty interesting. The bone looks very mature. It's just got this really weird, gnarly texture, which I don't really associate with young, fast-growing animals. It looks like it's, mature if not old, but it seems to come from an animal that's a bit smaller than Titanosaurus. So we think it might be a second taxon. So what is this animal related to? It might seem you couldn't really do much with a tibia, but there's a surprising amount of information, almost every single bone in the skeleton. If you really dive in there, you can find some really interesting features and often place individual bones down to low taxonomic level. So here, if you compare this animal to just kind of did these little line drawings, lined up all these different tibiae and okay, what does this thing look like? There was a little bit in Sesame Street years ago. It's one of these things is not like the other. It's kind of like that game. You kind of try and figure out, okay, it's not like this. What is it like? And if you play this little game, this City Shannon tibia, what does it look like? Well, it looks like South American abelisaurids. It's got this kind of hatchet-shaped crest on the knee with this little hook kind of coming down, this little process kind of hooking over. It kind of goes up and then hooks down. And the only other animals I've seen that in are animals like Kilnesaurus and Allosaurus from the late Cretaceous of South America. So again, we're having these kind of faunal connections between Africa and South America. And again, this is kind of what got me to look at Carnotaurus again and say, okay, we actually do have something related to South American taxa. So again, how are they moving between these continents? When did this happen? We don't really know. Hopefully we'll get more information. But curiously, these abelisaurs seem to be related not to the European things next door, not to the things in Madagascar, but to the things in South America. So another bone that turned up a few years ago is this little metatarsal here. And again, they're kind of frustrating, fragmentary little puzzles, very tantalizing. And it's like you just go, God, I wish we had the rest of this animal, because whatever this came from is something interesting. It's a very small gracile metatarsal. The bone texture is quite dense. It looks mature. So if this is an adult animal, it's a very small abelisaur, maybe something like about 3 or 4 meters long. So smaller than Titanosaurus, smaller than the other abelisaurid tibia from City Chenin. It seems that it might be a third very small-bodied taxon. So what is it related to? Well, this really gracile metatarsal, it's very laterally compressed, is a primitive feature. You see this in noasaurids. You see this in Spectrovenator, which is a mid-Cretaceous abelisaurid, a very primitive small-bodied form. And you tend to have much more robust metatarsals in things like Alcosaurus or Majungasaurus, these other abelisaurs. So the implication is that this might be a very primitive abelisaurid, not closely related to other taxa there. Again, we're just going to have to find more bones. I mean, could I be wrong? Of course I could be wrong. It's a single bone. You can get a lot out, but you can also be misled by features. And so what we're going to have to do is hopefully, eventually one of these days, more specimens turn up and we can try and make sense of this thing and figure out what it actually represents. My current thing is I think it's some sort of small primitive abelisauroid. I guess it could be related to the small abelisauroids that we get in France, for example, and Spain. Who knows? I would stake a beer on this. I'd bet you a beer that that's what it is. I wouldn't bet, $1 million and wouldn't bet my life. It's just paleontology. You make your best, you do the best you can with what you've got until something better comes along. So what do we have here? If we're correct that these things are all adults, and the bone texture suggests that, we haven't had a chance to chop into the bones yet and don't really have the facilities to do that in Morocco, unfortunately, but hopefully, more mature, more animals might turn up that would shed light on this. What we think we might have here are several distinct size classes. We have Chinanosaurus is the apex predator, the largest abelisaurid in the fauna. The City Chenin abelisaurid seems to be a somewhat smaller animal. And this very, even smaller, very lightly built primitive abelisaurid, maybe only about, 3 or 4 meters long. So, one's maybe about 8 or 9 meters, one's about 5 or 6, one's about 3 or 4. So they're occupying several different distinct size classes. And what this would imply is a fairly, healthy predator fauna. And, if there's a lot of niche partitioning going on, they're specializing on different resources. There's probably, if you have high predator diversity, you've got high prey diversity and high abundance. So it's probably a pretty functional ecosystem, just looking at the predators. They're kind of an indicator species and tell us that our ecosystem is pretty diverse towards the end, if we've correctly interpreted this. Sauropods. Sauropod remains have turned up. These are fairly large animals. They're like, elephant size, maybe 10 tons. They're not like super giant, like 30 to 50 ton sauropods. So by sauropod standards, they're kind of small, but sauropod standards obviously go from like kind of big to really big to colossally huge. These are going to be the top herbivores in the assemblage. They're probably titanosaurs. I've seen a few vertebrae that have that kind of distinctive, ball and socket joint in the tail vertebrae, which is typical of titanosaurs. What has turned up so far, at least what's been described so far, is not very informative. We do have some more bones that we're looking at. I can't really say much about them right now because the study's not done. Also, titanosaurs turn out to be really, really hard to figure out. Titanosaur phylogeny is a mess trying to figure out what species are related to what species. Every single evolutionary tree seems to disagree with every single other evolutionary tree. So it's really hard to figure out how to classify your animal because everybody's got a different classificatory scheme. So yeah, we do have some more fossils. We're working on them. If you're curious about what these fossils represent, well, so am I. And as soon as I know, I'll tell you. The other thing in the assemblage, in the herbivore assemblage, and the really surprising thing here is the presence of duckbill dinosaurs, which is like the last thing I would have expected, because duckbill dinosaurs are coming out of North America and Asia, and Africa is isolated by water. But this little jaw popped up, a maxilla and a fragment of another maxilla and dentary, that was immediately recognizable as a duckbill dinosaur based on these very unusual, highly specialized teeth. and comparisons revealed that it's closely related to these lambeosaurs coming from Europe, the Dinosaurs. And it seems like the duckbills must have dispersed over water. Maybe a herd swam the several hundred miles of open water between Southwest Europe and North Africa, or maybe some juveniles dispersed on a raft of vegetation or something like that. Some babies were swept out to sea and washed up in Morocco. We don't really know, but we do have duckbill dinosaurs in Morocco, which is kind of one of the shocks in my life to recognize these animals. So the first duckbill that we described, the first duckbill of several duckbills, we described as Ajnabia odysseus. Ajnabia means foreigner or stranger in Arabic. Odysseus refers, of course, to the mythological Greek seafarer. And we really didn't expect to see any more of this animal, and we didn't expect to see any more duckbills either. And yet a few years later, another duckbill specimen turned up. And at first I'm like, oh yeah, well, another Ajnabia, been there, done that, and took another look at it and was like, wait, this is something different. So this is the second duckbill. It includes both upper and lower jaws and a partial brain case. And the brain case is really neat because, looking at Ajnabia, it kind of looked like a mature animal based on the bone texture. Very dense, well-developed bone texture, typical of adult animals. And this animal shows that the sutures are tightly knit together and partially fused. So this animal stopped growing, but it's not very big. It's about the size of a pony. So whereas in North America, we have these great big giant duckbills getting maybe 15 tons, things like Magnipolia, Edmontosaurus getting 10 tons. We have much, much smaller duckbills filling a distinct niche in North Africa, filling this small herbivore niche that duckbills didn't really occupy in the same way in North America. So the maxilla turns out to be distinct from Ajnabia. The jugal attaches very low on the maxilla, which is a very unusual feature. The tooth row has a different shape. It's kind of sinuous in either ventral view or in lateral view. It's kind of twisted. So it's similar to Ajnabia, but something different. We named the species Mincaria bata, which is Arabic for beak and duck. And then a third duckbill turned up. And again, this is not something I was expecting. I figured, well, it's probably another Ajnabia, maybe it's a Mincaria. And this was something else entirely. It has a reduced tooth count, but the teeth are hugely enlarged. The tooth sockets kind of open to the side. And the lateral on the lateral surface of the tooth crown, we have these huge blade-like keels running up the side of the tooth. So it has this very specialized dentition that doesn't look like other African duckbills, or really like other duckbills for that matter. And we named this taxon Toileda being the Moroccan Arabic for 3, since it was our third duckbill. A few other remains have turned up. There's a femur and a humerus. And it's hard to do much with these because they don't overlap with the other specimens, and these aren't the most diagnostic bones of the duckbill skeleton. What is interesting is they seem to come from larger animals than either Ajnabia, Mincaria, or Toileda. They seem to represent larger duckbills. Now, could they represent kind of the outliers in terms of, individual variation in the population? These are very, very large individuals. Could it be that some of the duckbills we've seen are not fully mature and they got a little bit bigger? Even sexual dimorphism? This is all possible. Could they represent a distinct species or several species of larger duckbills that are coexisting with these smaller ones? That's another possibility. I don't have a strong preference of this. My hunch is it's quite likely there's something else in the fauna that's a bit bigger. But again, we just need to get more fossils, and hopefully sooner or later something will turn up that will either show, that will one way or another confirm whether these are something different or just larger individuals of known species. So we're just going to have to wait for more fossils to figure these animals out. So what we have here is now a pretty diverse fauna. We have bones suggesting predators of multiple distinct size classes. We have sauropods filling the big herbivore niche. We have duckbills, multiple duckbills, filling the small herbivore niche. This is just before the extinction of the dinosaurs. And what we have is a low latitude assemblage in Morocco, in North Africa. And it shows a lot of ecological diversity, a lot of different niches being occupied. There's also some things we haven't seen so far. We've seen no other ornithischians. Europe has telmatosaurs and rhabdodontids. We're not seeing those here. We're not seeing these coelurosaurs. Again, you might expect to see like an Unionlagian. We have those in Europe. We have those in South America. It's possible some of these things are there. We just haven't found them yet, in which case we're just going to have to keep looking. What I think is interesting is that we have a distinct composition of clades from what we see elsewhere in the world. We have a combination of these South American-looking abelisaurs, European-looking duckbills. The sauropods, we're not really sure what they're related to, but we have sauropods in there as well. And so it's distinct from any other dinosaur assemblage out there, and very, very distinct from what you'd see in Western North America, where you have ceratopsians dominating and large duckbills and these tyrannosaurs. Here we have little duckbills, titanosaurs, and abelisaurids. So what we're seeing is dinosaur faunas are evolving in very different ways in different parts of the world. You know, some of that might be that certain clades thrive at low latitudes or high latitudes. Some of it might just be differential extinction. A group went extinct in this part of the world, but not another part of the world. Sauropods go extinct in the Middle Cretaceous in North America, and it takes them a long time to be reestablished there. And part of it's just like kind of the luck of dispersal. Duckbills kind of by chance managed to cross water into North Africa and radiate, and different groups managed to disperse into different continents. And so just kind of by chance, but these various, some deterministic processes, things like different climates, different habitats, chance of extinction, chance of dispersal, we end up seeing these dinosaur faunas, the end of Cretaceous, that are evolving in completely different ways, with completely different species and completely different lineages dominate, and just different ecosystems in different worlds. There isn't one dinosaur fauna at the end of the Cretaceous, but a whole series of them. So, what does Morocco tell us about the rest of Africa? And I'm not really sure. My original thinking is that we were getting a picture of what Africa was doing at the end of the Cretaceous period. But then I started talking to people who are working elsewhere, who are working, in the Arabian Peninsula and Oman, or who are working on stuff from East Africa. And I'm like, do you guys have any ornithopods there? I'm like, oh yeah, we do. And I'm like, do you have duckbills maybe? And I'm like, nope, we don't. We've got something else. And this stuff is still being worked on, but we're not seeing, apparently it sounds like so far nobody has found duckbills anywhere else in Africa, which is really interesting because they're really diverse and they're very common in Morocco, but they don't seem to be that way in East Africa. And again, maybe tomorrow somebody will find one in Egypt or Kenya or something like that, or Oman. But so far nobody has. And so this raises some interesting questions. How exactly is Morocco connected to the rest of Africa? Is it connected, or is it possible that it's preserving a distinct fauna? That not only is Morocco distinct from the rest of the world, it's even distinct from Africa. So a model for looking at distinct dinosaur faunas is North America. So North America is bisected by the Western Interior Seaway. We have a sea that runs north from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Arctic Ocean and cuts North America in two. So basically, going up through, Kansas and Saskatchewan and into the Arctic, where we have a shallow sea. And North America isn't a single continent with a single fauna, but it's two distinct continents, or maybe even there might even be a third continent up north. And the dinosaurs are isolated and they evolve in very different ways. And we find completely distinct species. So you might assume that a giant animal like T-Rex would just kind of roam all across North America, but it can't because of the seaway. So we have as T-Rex lives in the western part of North America, this landmass that's been called Laramidia. And in the eastern part of North America, the landmass that we've named Appalachia, we have a distinct tyrannosaur called Dryptosaurus. And Dryptosaurus has these huge claws, it's got great big arms. So you can tell it's pretty different from the T-Rex, because T-Rex has these dinky little arms, and Dryptosaurus has these really just powerful, terrifying talons. They're very, very different animals, separated by the seaway. Likewise, the duckbills evolve in different directions. At the end of the Cretaceous in Western North America, we have this animal Edmontosaurus, a Saurolophine that dominates. And in Eastern North America, from New Jersey, we have an animal called Hadrosaurus, which is part of the Hadrosaurinae, which we used to think was related to Western things, but now appears to be kind of a distinct duckbill lineage. We have this very unusual phenomenon where Hadrosaurus, and which gave us the hadrosaurs, the name, is kind of off on its own and not closely related to most of the other duckbills. We also have a phenomenon where you have titanosaurs in the West. We have titanosaurs in New Mexico and Texas and Utah, but we do not get them in New Jersey. So we have very different faunas in North America because they're isolated by seaways. Could something similar be going on in Africa? In the late Cretaceous, a similar thing happens where we have very high sea levels and a sea floods the Sahara. And that's kind of wild to think about it. Today it's the sand sea, but back then it was a sea. you could sail across the Sahara in a sailboat. And this is called the Trans-Saharan Seaway, and it cuts Africa in two. It runs the Mediterranean in the north, down south through the Sahara, and empties into the Gulf of Guinea in the Atlantic Ocean and bisects the continent. So could we have two distinct land masses? Maybe the eastern landmass, the ancient word would have been, I guess, for Africa would have been Ethiopia. That's what the ancients called it. That might be a cool name for that kind of eastern landmass. Maybe Mauritania could be the western landmass. And maybe what we're seeing is the fact that we have duckbills in Morocco, but so far not on the other landmass, is we're seeing these two separate faunas evolve, and Africa isn't like a lost world of dinosaurs, but a couple different lost worlds, each going off in their own evolutionary trajectory. But if you look at the map and in some of these maps, Morocco is not even connected to the rest of West Africa. So is Morocco in fact part of the Western landmass, or is it its own little island continent like Madagascar, kind of evolving in isolation? And this weird little fauna of duckbills and titanosaurs and abelisaurs is just kind of an endemic Northwest African landmass fauna. And what would we call this continent? I don't know, I think Barbaria would sound kind of cool after the Barbary coast. We don't know. I mean, some people will say, well, aren't you speculating here? Well, yes, I am speculating. Another word for speculation is hypothesis. These are hypotheses, and obviously the thing to do is go out and test them. And I'll be excited either way. I mean, if somebody finds duckbills in East Africa and Egypt, that'll be really exciting. And if duckbills never turn up there, that'll also be exciting. Either way, I think it's interesting to ask about and trying to figure out what's going on here. But I think there may be some, even within Africa, there may have been different faunas. So it's not just different continents are going off in different directions, but even within continents, because of this isolation, these seaways, we're seeing distinct faunas emerge at different parts of the world at the end of the Cretaceous period. So what's it all mean? What it means is dinosaurs are doing very different things in different parts of the world just before the end of Cretaceous mass extinction. Now, it is possible that places like Montana and Alberta saw species decline, but we really don't know if that's a regional pattern or a global pattern. It might just have to do with, changes, the regression of the seaway as it gets further from the sea. Maybe the diversity goes down. It could be that these are fairly high latitude assemblages. Montana was a bit further north at the time than it is now. Maybe as you get hit by Maastrichtian cooling, it hits these areas pretty hard, but not so much the tropics. We don't really know if this is a general phenomenon or not. Another question is whether species counting is really the best way to look at diversity. We like to count species because it's easy. Look at lists of species and just tabulate them up. But is that the most informative way to understand an ecosystem? Is just like how many different species there are. I think a more interesting approach might be to look at their functional diversity. That is the range of ecological niches, the range of different things that they do. And what we're seeing is if we look around the world, both within the Western interior and in places like Africa and the Gobi Desert, what we're seeing is a huge range of niche occupation that remains high or even increases in the Maastrichtian. So it does seem like we get fewer species of duckbill and horned dinosaur in the Western interior towards the end of the Cretaceous period, but most of these species differences, they're quite redundant. You've kind of seen one duckbill, you've sort of seen them all. They kind of have like slightly different wiggles to their crest and, that type of thing. And the ceratopsians have slightly different scallops and things like that. They're functionally quite similar. And what happens as you go into the Maastrichtians, you might be seeing fewer species in the Western interior, but they're doing a wider range of things. You're getting giant ceratopsians and great big duckbills and giant tyrannosaurs appear. And then immigration is also kind of increasing the niche occupations ecosystems. So in Africa, in the Maastrichtian is when the duckbills are coming in and then radiating. And then in North America, we have titanosaurs coming in. And in South America, you have a different duckbill lineage moving in. So I think what we're actually seeing is towards the end of the Cretaceous, I'm not sure what's going on with species diversity. I think niche occupation is staying high or maybe increasing as things evolve into new niches and then disperse to different land masses. And so I think what we're seeing is, I think dinosaurs are a diverse and vibrant and ecologically successful group. This is not a group in trouble, I don't think. So what do we need to do next? We can keep doing analyses. And I mean, they're worth doing. But ultimately, I think what's going to move the field forward and what moves science forward is new data. And we just need to go, get out and look for more dinosaurs and, take a closer look at what we've already found. Hell Creek definitely has surprises, I'm convinced. I don't think we found everything. I think as we keep, as we sample and sample and sample, we're going to start to find rarer species and things that don't preserve very often. And I'm sure there's some surprises out there. That being said, North America is just one part of the story. So what else do we need to do? One thing we need is better dates. The Nemegd is a really interesting fauna. It's maybe the second most diverse known dinosaur fauna after Dinosaur Park in Canada. And we do not know how old it is. But the western exposures of the Nemegd are directly overlain by the Paleocene. It could be latest Maastrichtian. From just a stratigraphic superposition thing, it's just like it's entirely possible that the western part of the Nemegd, Tarbosaurus and things like that out there are equivalent to the Hell Creek in age and just before the dinosaur extinction. And if so, that's going to change your diversity curves, because all of a sudden these species of sort of indeterminate Maastrichtian age are pushed right up to the very end. And that would tend to imply diversity is not declining everywhere and is remaining higher, even increasing towards the end. Again, we don't really know. We need better dates, which is easier said than done, figuring out how old something is. And then we need new fossils from Morocco. This just takes a lot of patience. Things turn up very slowly there. You're basically, again, it's like mosasaur, 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 and then every once in a while dinosaur. And so it's taken us about 10 years to put together this picture of dinosaur diversity in Morocco. And we'll probably need to keep at it for another 10 years, if not longer, trying to find all the other rare species out there. So we need to keep collecting from places like Morocco. And then we need new localities. What's striking to me, looking at the map, is just how much remains unknown. And it's kind of tantalizing and kind of terrifying and despair-inducing at the same time. There are huge land masses. There's Arctic Canada, there's Greenland, there's Australia, there's New Zealand, and most of Africa, from which barely anything or nothing is known. We do not know what the dinosaurs were doing here at the end of the Cretaceous period. And it's sort of tantalizing, but it's also like, if these areas had lots of fossils and they were easy to find, they'd be explored already. Areas where we don't currently have dinosaurs are that way for a reason. There may be few fossils. There may not be a lot of exposed outcrop. Maybe it's like high up in the mountains or cliff faces that are difficult to prospect. Maybe there's no infrastructure, no roads or airstrips to get in there. Might be political issues, security issues, war. There's various reasons why these places are not producing a lot of dinosaurs. The low-hanging fruit is gone. These highly productive beds that are safe and easy to access with great road access like the Hell Creek. The Hell Creek was found over 100 years ago. And so most of the good dinosaur deposits have been known for a long time. The easy places are gone. But I don't think we found everything. We can't have found everything. I think if 10 years ago you predicted that Morocco would produce one of the most important late Maastrichtian faunas in the world, no one would have believed you. I would not have believed you. Why would that come from a marine assemblage of all places? And yet here we are, slowly piecing together the late Maastrichtian dinosaurs, the last dinosaurs of Africa. There are still discoveries out there waiting to be made.